Hey, are you hiring? If you answered yes, let XenTegra Staffing help staff your IT people needs. Head over to XenTegra.com/XenTegra Staffing to find out more. XenTegra Staffing, we can staff your IT people needs. Welcome to another edition of the Citrix Session with your hosts, Andy Whiteside and Bill Sutton, your source for all things Citrix.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 36 of the Citrix Session podcast. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. We have with us today Blair Parker, who's an enterprise architect at Citrix. Blair, did I get your title right?
That's true. That's correct.
And Blair had a blog from, sometime in June? Yeah, June 3rd, called The Lessons Learned from the Field, Citrix ADC Migrations, which is very technical. And we're going to jump through and go through that blog with Blair and cover the content there. Blair, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do and where you're located.
I'm located in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. I'm the enterprise architect for Citrix and networking for Canada and U.S. commercial. I also obviously help out with other geos as well if required. My background is extensive networking. I used to work for an ISP in Canada before Citrix. So I have extensive networking, firewall, data center, and so on experience.
No, that's great. I got to get you connected with Chris Dorn on our team that runs our networking practice. I don't know if you guys know each other, but I'm sure there's a lot of value in your insights that Chris and the team could glean from having some conversations with him.
What my experience, I think, lends to is I just think of the other stuff outside the ADC as well, like the firewalls, the routing, layer 2, layer 3, networking, different terminologies and other vendors and so on.
That's an interesting topic, and maybe it'll come up more in this conversation. But if you're going to be a Citrix application delivery controller guy, or even SD-WAN, but a Citrix application delivery controller guy, aka ADC, it's interesting because you need to be a route switch guy. You need to understand the layer 1, layer 2, layer 3 of the networks. But at the same time, you got to understand layer 4, 5, 6, and 7. It's a very unique skill set that people either come at from one angle or the other, but it's very rare that you find somebody that understands all the way up from layer 1 to layer 7.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It was kind of ironic when I first moved to Citrix. One of my former colleagues at the ISP said, back then before the ADC, what is a NetScaler? And I said, really, it's a layer 3 switch on steroids. Right.
Where would you, if you had to say one layer, and guys, we're talking about the OSI model here of, protocol development and communications. I right when I said that, I have a way of memorizing that to get all the different layers right. If you had to pick one layer, Blair, where the ADC spends most of its time, is it layer 3 or is it somewhere higher in the stack?
2 to 7.
2 to 7.
Really.
Okay. So you gave me that consultant answer of it depends, right?
It depends because, we're the customer facing device or service. There's so much in between that, obviously the end user doesn't realize. And, if you're running a VDI through storefront, the ADC is running at a different layer, or if you're checking for a responder or a rewrite or a post or HTTPS monitor, there's just so many different layers that are involved there.
Yeah, and I think you said one of the key things there. The user needs to know nothing about all the magical, maddening things that are happening for both performance and security reasons. I've got this thing at my house, right? So every time you can't get to a website, it means the computer's bad. And I'm like, well, no, the computer's not bad. There's thousands and thousands of things that are happening simultaneously to make you get to that website. It could be that the website's down, or whatever's load balancing or front ending is down. All that doesn't matter, right? All that doesn't matter to the user. They just want it up and working and fast. But the magical piece that they see, which isn't really magic, it's technology, that you have to know happens somewhere between that layer 1 through 7 stack.
That's correct. I mean, I also go into, maybe customers are having an issue. Citrix is slow. And one particular customer, not naming any names, I had a look at their network and they were trying to run full BGP on a layer 3 switch outside of the ADCs. So the switch was at 100%, which had nothing to do with the performance of the ADC.
So I don't know if you know this, but I used to be a Citrix SE, and my very first NetScaler POC that I did was with a local hospital, and we were halfway through configuring the NetScaler, and the entire network went down. And I looked at the networking overlay from Citrix, and I was going, what did we do? Did we break it? I felt certain that we did something to break it, and he was adamant that we didn't do anything, and I just didn't know the product well enough at that time to understand what had happened. And truth is, they had a network outage right in the middle of a setup for a NetScaler POC, and of course, everything we were doing got impacted, but we had nothing to do with taking down the network. But I was scared to death that we were going to get the blame for it.
Yep.
All right. So if you can you see my screen?
I can.
All right. So your first section here talks about migration considerations, and then you jump into a couple. You want to give us just kind of an overview of what you're talking about in this section of the article?
Sure. One of the terms we used in the ISP world back was called forklifting. And the last thing you want to do as a consultant is have the customer forklift their gear out because it's not big enough or it hasn't been planned appropriately for growth, for SSL, for throughput, for everything like that. So one of the things you always want to, as a consultant, is what's the current load on the network as far as applications, throughput, so on, and what's forecasted. You have a lot of companies, big financial companies that look at mergers, transactions. Will the network handle it if they take on another company, or in this current situation with COVID, if they send 90% of their workforce home? Right.
Yeah, that's a very true point. We got a project now. It's not ADC related, even though ADC is in the mix, where there's a recommendation, but we didn't, or the customer didn't, or both, go look at the current workload and use that as a great sizing benchmark. At least not enough, and now we're struggling because we're underpowered. And then, as you pointed out, when work life changes, and next thing you know, you used to be 10% remote users, 90% internal. All of a sudden, you're 90% remote and 10% internal. Your mileage is definitely going to vary in that scenario.
Right, and I feel that's where my experience comes in the networking side, because the 1 gigabit link is not going to handle 30,000 users.
Yeah. Well, and that brings up another topic, right? So it used to be we just threw a bunch of hardware at stuff, and these days now we size it appropriately, but in our back pocket we've got software and bandwidth and other things we can throw at it much quicker and easier than we could in the past, where it might take 6 months to get a new link put in.
And cost.
The
cost of the links have gone way down.
So your next section here talks about power, cooling, and racking. I think that's interesting as well, because in the scenario I was just telling you about, my first question to them, do you have enough space for this? Do you have enough power and cooling? And luckily, they've just retired a very legacy system, but that's certainly something that is an old school thought process and consideration, but that still exists even in the cloud world, especially when you're hosting in private data centers.
I have customers that have 2 ADCs up to over 100 ADCs, and there's customers even bigger than that out there. And is there power cooling? I had one customer put some switches near the floor, and people walking by were kicking the power cords out.
Wow.
So it's definitely it has to be, because these PDUs and cooling and that is rated for a certain level, and can't go surpass that level. or you start getting your monitoring and SNMP traps.
Yeah, you still got to have those electrical engineers involved somewhere in the mix to make sure you have enough of what you need, because it's there are limits, right? And people. You just can't keep plugging stuff up or trying to cool stuff. I'll tell you one quick story. I got on a bus at the airport here, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and I had a Citrix shirt on, and the guy talking to me said he was a Citrix guy, and he was going out to Apple to install a bunch of NetScalers. And I immediately jumped into the software configuration, app firewall type conversations, and he kind of looked at me and his eyes glazed over. Well, after I investigated a little more, he really just racked and stacked the stuff and made sure the power and cooling was what it needed to be. But, there is value in that, and that's certainly part of the equation then and still is, and making sure that stuff's covered should be pretty much step one, right?
Absolutely. Like, what if the power goes out? Like, will your UPSs handle the load?
Right. Your next section here talks about connectivity and the dreaded LACP, which probably means, it's probably light now. That's easy for you. I've been scared of that acronym my entire adult life in terms of trying to get aggregation of bandwidth through to whatever I was working on. You want to talk about where that applies?
Yeah, that's just it's redundancy and resiliency, I guess. It depends on what you're using it for. Link aggregation control protocol just combines the links together. I always, as a designer, though, if I have, let's say, 4 10 gig links in an LACP channel, I would only plan for 20 gig because you plan for what's going to go out, or even the 10 gig. It depends on your policy of when you're going to fail over or whatever. And the other part of that little conversation that sort of happens too often is we order the appliances, but no interfaces with the appliances, and that delays the project as well. One of the key things too with the LACP is make sure your ingress on the appliance matches the egress. So you're not dropping packets somewhere. You could have 40 gig into an LACP channel, but if you only have 10 gig out, it's not gonna fly.
Well, that's really appropriate too, right? Because it's the ADCs are allowing, for the most part, external access to your internal resources, and those internal resources are going to deliver content to that outside user, or maybe inside user, but on the way out of it at least. And you're right. I mean, a lot of people, your SFP comments, absolutely. I can't tell you how many times we've run into a project where those didn't get ordered, the appropriate ones get ordered, and next thing you know, you're standing around for 2 days or 3 days. And then not having the appropriate, egress to go along with the ingress. Exactly what you said, right? It's often forgotten about, less so these days, right? Because a lot of the connectivity is bidirectional at the same rate, or the same bandwidth. But back in the day, right, it was a big difference between the download and the upload speeds.
And the other quick note about the SFPs is try not to mix the vendors because they're usually not supported then.
Right.
And I always get the question, there's a difference between will they work or why are they supported?
Yeah. And that's usually where somebody's trying to save a few bucks and they had a few laying around and they ordered a few different ones. And next thing you know, you got a mix match.
Right.
All right. Next section talks about IP addressing and VLANing. And how that applies to projects often. You want to cover that?
Yeah. So customers come in migrations with, here's what I have. I don't have any IP addresses left. I want to move it. So that's really the newer reuse. If you have to reuse IP addressing, then your challenge is testing. It's so hard to test anything if you can't turn it on. If you turn it on, you're gonna run into duplicate IPs.
Yep.
As far as network,
you're talking about public IPs and private IPs. We run into both those challenges, don't you?
Yes, more the public, but you also most organizations I deal with are very controlled around their IP addressing, and maybe only. Sometimes IP addressing is used to identify a location as well. Let's say the third octet, and that way your support guys know right away where the SNMP trap comes from or whatever. But I try to steer the customer towards using new IP addressing, because then we can test. We can bring up parallel systems. If you have a large load balancing, let's say, infrastructure, you can move over applications. You don't have to move them all at once. You can move them on your leisure, and when your support teams and software owners and so on can test and validate the access to the application.
And what you're referring to there is if you have new public IPs or even private IPs, but for testing purposes, the simple ability to go into a host file and change the resolution to your new IP and do testing, it's a beautiful thing when you have that at your availability.
Correct. The only thing you got to watch there is east-west traffic. If something's calling something up that's not using your host file, that's where you might stand up a temporary DNS server or something like that. Right. And the other part of that is about the trunk and access port. I have a very extensive Cisco experience as well. And I always like to use trunk ports right off the bat because then it's so much easier if you have to add a VLAN than it is to have to reconfigure an access port to a trunk, because all of a sudden you need more than one VLAN across there.
And that's really applies to the keep it simple model if you can, right? If you can't, so be it. But if you can, keep it simple.
Correct. Well, you think about it too is if you think of the ADC as a network appliance and it's connecting to another network appliance, well, 99% of that is a trunk port most of the time for two network appliances.
And you've covered this in the beginning, but let's call it out again. The Citrix ADC, formerly known as NetScaler, is in fact a router and a switch at its roots, but then it's really smart with software on top of those layers of the OSI model. That's
correct. Like, to me, it's when I go into my thinking, my methodology, I go from layer 1 to 7, and I just think of it as a layer 3 switch a lot of times.
Yeah. And I would challenge people, right? If they don't know the OSI model and a good comprehension of those layers, then that's a really good place to start. I work with a lot of people that their thinking doesn't start at those layers and what happens at those individual layers, and it's really hard to have a conversation with them because they're thinking beyond what you need them to grasp in the initial conversations that need to cover layer 1 through 3 in the basic routing and switching.
Yeah, the packet still has to get there, right? So it doesn't matter what it is, what VDI or whatever, the packet still has to get there. In my experience, I've seen some projects that started the other way from layer 7 to 1, and by the time they got down to 3 and 2, it was a challenge to try to make it work.
Right. All right. Layer 3 considerations. What are you covering in this section?
Well, you have to, as a consultant, you have to know what the customer's strategies is as far as layer 3. I've taught some new hire training. I'm not looking for the ADC to be the default router of the network. There is some like direct server return that it needs to be, or maybe a tiered architecture that has to do some layer 2, layer 3. But one of the things, sometimes if you have a core routing infrastructure, let that do the heavy lifting of the layer 3 routing.
Yeah, so that conversation comes up a lot, right? Can the NetScaler do X and Y, layer 3 stuff? Absolutely, it can. However, you've bought equipment that's specialized in that. Right. You've got knowledge of how to do it with that equipment. Let that equipment do it, unless you ultimately just can't. And you talked about the direct return a while ago. I mean, I can't tell you how many times that's come up in terms of trying to figure out why something wasn't working. But yeah, good point. Talking about letting your specific data center devices and software do their job that they were designed to do, right?
Yeah. There's a little funny saying is let the $1 million boxes do their job.
Yes, indeed. Protocols and ports. I think this is probably going to go back to our OSI model conversation a little bit, but what are we covering in this section?
Well, in these migrations, you could have 5 applications or 500 or 5,000 applications, and you're obviously going to have a list. Your what, where, when, why of what's being run now. But a lot of migrations too, there might be something new. You might be migrating from a SSL VPN solution from one vendor to another, or if you think about our different ports and proprietary, like for Citrix infrastructures, maybe they're getting a new Citrix infrastructure, which I see quite a bit as far as migrations. 1494, 2598, things like that. More, data, voice, UDP. Is that going to be coming in? Different, obviously, with remote access, you have more and more vendors out there with, GoToMeeting, Teams, Skype, so on. What protocols, ports have to be open for that? Is that new? Things like that.
So Blair, I have a question I have to ask you. It's kind of funny. I can't wait to hear your answer. How many times have you telnetted to a port to see if it was listening in your career? Could you estimate?
Well, I don't think I could count that high, but
yeah.
The thing that I try to discourage though is pinging something, because one, ICMP is usually blocked, but why do you use UDP to test TCP?
Right. Yeah, and that's why I brought up the telnet thing. It's a really good chance to check. And like you pointed out, a lot of people who don't know any different, they just ping something. Well, it's pingable, so it must work. And that's a totally different protocol, totally different port, and might have almost nothing to do. Ping is an application all to itself, right? And honestly, I didn't know that it was UDP. Ping is UDP, right?
Ping is UDP, yeah.
Yeah.
One of the non-published, I guess, tools we have with the ADC is just create a service.
Oh, somebody showed me that 4 or 5 years ago, and if that thing's green, then it's listening and doing
right. Your firewall's open, your routing's good, so on. And
it does it from the appropriate interface too. That's the other thing too, right? It's not doing it from the management; It's doing it from the SNP.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, this next section covers licensing, which I know sounds like it should be a trivial thing, but knowing what you're licensed for and knowing where that license is at is, I can't tell you how many projects that stalled us for at least hours trying to get licensing, especially in the old days, on the machine and in place.
That's correct. Like standard licensing, it doesn't allow AAA N factor. Whereas, you need an advanced license. OTP needs platinum and premium licensing. So there's just, when you're doing this first, requirement gathering, make sure the license matches up with the requirements.
Right. And I think one of the challenges in the Citrix world is, and you tell me how much you run into this, you're normally working with Windows systems administrators and not route switch guys, or at least in a lot of cases. And this is a whole different world. And I try to convince people, hey, if you can go learn this world and know the Windows world, you're going to be a very special resource and very valuable. But I have to assume you run into a lot of folks that, maybe you get handed a Windows Server admin and this is all Greek to them.
I get both. I get or networking guys handed, that are not that familiar with layer 7 and so on.
Right.
I'm actually an MCSE too, but that was a while ago.
Well, you kind of got to have it all covered. If you're going to be a true ADC guy, and specifically Citrix ADC, it's a layer 1 through 7. I don't know how many times we've said this on this meeting, on this call so far, but it really does handle the whole stack. Next section you have here is titled Monitoring and Managing Who and What. What are we covering there?
Well, I think it just goes back to the previous conversation we just had. Is it the server guy? Is it the network guy? Like who monitors and manages the ADCs? That has to be ironed out. Who responds to the tickets, the escalations? We have, quite a few of our clients have third-party vendors that support the ADCs. and that all has to be worried out. Obviously, I'm a big fan of our ADM. I like to use it for managing, monitoring single pane of glass, so on.
Right. Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because the historical value of the ADC was the ability to give people secure access to what they needed to access. And that hasn't changed, right? But the future value of ADC types of appliances, either physical or virtual, is, in addition to what we just talked about, the analytics, both from a security and performance perspective, that having this, this entry in and out of the network for these applications is going to create great value in what you can monitor and glean from it, right?
That's correct. It gives that, that user says, it's slow or something, there's your first point as you look at your ADM, try to find the user. But going back again, you need the certain licensing. The base license only goes for an hour for analytics. And again, you have to make sure that your requirements meet up with the license, which will meet up with your managing and monitoring, and it all fits together.
Yeah. And this next bullet talks about basic to advanced policies. And this is where honestly I get lost, because I grew up on NetScaler doing very basic things, using basic built-in policies. And then at some point, using the expressions to really extend the capabilities of what you could implement on the NetScaler. That's where I can go a little deep, but it takes really educated and experienced ADC guys to jump into those advanced policies. And as you're pointing out here, that's pretty much where you should go these days. Don't even bother with the basic ones, right?
I guess it could have been a little more clear with this one too. Like, this is more the syntax of some basic syntax that's being deprecated in the code.
Right.
And the other thing too, like, I'm a huge fan of N factor, like that, to have that flexibility of different authentication or non-authentication, storing passwords and usernames and so on. Like, there should be no basic authentication anymore, really. It should be all advanced, use N factor, and make sure when you do your migrations that you're not going to configure something that might be deprecated in Q3 or Q4.
Oh, I get it. Yeah, some of the stuff that's legacy at this point and been replaced with new syntax and new commands.
Correct.
Can you just stop real quick and give me your definition of N factor? I've heard that term forever. I think I know that allows me to use multiple authentication methods. But can you just give us one or two sentences on what N factor is?
Well, that's exactly what it is. I'll use a company I just did. They only allow 3 different browsers. So your first factor could be just looking at the header and what type of browser it is. Then it goes to and there's a non-authentication. And then your next factor might be LDAP. And after that, you could do it like a group extraction in N factor that says this group of users has to use 2-factor authentication, and this group of users doesn't, and so on. So it's really policies that, with that algorithm, and you can be very flexible and very specific to the users and the user requirements.
Okay, great. The next section of the blog talks about migration types, and I guess we're talking hardware and virtual and software. And you want to cover, kind of talk through what you're covering in this section of the blog?
Yeah, these are just the most common migrations I see. Like, we get there's obviously ADC models that become end of life, end of maintenance. So that one's probably the most popular one. I've been with Citrix now for 6 years, 6 years next week.
Yep.
And that's probably the most common one, is one's end of maintenance, end of life. Expandability, like those MPX 15,000s or 50Gs are just horses, like what they can put through.
Right.
The 5500s is an end of life. So you might see a smaller MPX go to a virtual appliance, depending on requirements and throughput and so on. One of the things that you try to do is, in this migration, is try to work with sales and the SE teams and make sure the right ADC appliance is being provisioned for the migration.
And Blair, let's cover that a little bit because we had the hardware days, which when I was a Citrix SC, the conversation was always about offloading of the SSL and how much value that brings. Now, these days, I think a lot of that's done within software. So those offloading chips are not as relevant as they used to be. I assume you're seeing most people move to a virtual appliance or maybe even the service.
Both. I have one company over 100 MPXs. It depends. It depends on the, if you're doing 30,000 users, and you don't have that large a footprint, you probably want an MPX. But also too, workspace, virtualization, cloud. We see it all right now. It depends on the user requirements. And I had one client that closed all their data centers and gone completely to the cloud.
So let's talk through that, right? You had the old days of MPX, which was basically the firmware running on physical hardware, and then the SDX showed up where we could virtualize on top of a hypervisor layer and still use physical hardware. And then now a lot of stuff is done in virtual appliances, either in the primary data center or the customer's data center or colo, or in a cloud like an Azure, AWS, GCP. Are you seeing more people moving to VPXs both in their data center and in the cloud?
Yeah. Well, as an enterprise architect, I'm the technical authority for different projects, and I see them all really.
Yeah.
I see large financial institutions staying with the MPX and the SDX because they want to keep their information in their data centers and with high SSL throughput, and they can also carve out PCI environments and so like that, things like that. You see other maybe not quite as SSL throughput requirements, maybe using the software VPXs on their own hypervisor.
And I'm pulling up this article here around pool capacity. I guess that's why in most cases, Citrix is talking to clients about pool capacity that allows you to do, all the above simultaneously.
Correct. And it allows you also to move your bandwidth around in your environment. And also it gives you that single pane of glass for your licensing as well.
And we haven't even talked about CPXs, right? The containerized ADCs.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of those yet, but I'm more in the networking projects.
I have to assume in the pool capacity world, you're seeing mostly bandwidth pooled, or are you seeing CPU pooling, or a little bit of both?
Bandwidth, mainly bandwidth I've seen so far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, and then the other question I have for you, and you may not know the answer to this, but I run into it occasionally, the ability to use Citrix ADC as a service. So it's part of the Citrix Cloud offerings. Where does that stand? Does Citrix have a full-blown ADC as a service that does everything that the VPXs and MPXs and SDXs do, or is that still a work in progress?
You mean in the ADCs in the cloud?
Well, no, ADC is a service where Citrix hosts it as a service, and you don't have your own VPX at all. It's just it's a service that's part of the Citrix Cloud offerings, and maybe that doesn't exist yet, and I just keep hearing about it and wondering when it's coming.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that yet. I do a lot of Azure and AWS and overseeing projects like that, though. Google now do it as well.
And that's a good conversation too, right? So running your own ADC that you own, so a VPX, I guess any cloud that allows you to import an OVA is going to allow you to do that, is that right?
Yeah, they have their own subscriptions, or you can bring your own license. Again, everything revolves around licensing and subscriptions. Obviously, the advantage of the cloud is you don't have to maintain that infrastructure, and it's always being updated. One of the recommendations I give to my clients when they do go to the cloud is to keep up to date on their literature, because just the last few years it's improved so much. You just have to keep what's new, what's happening, what's supported, and so on.
Yeah, I think this is, if you can see my screen, I think this is what I was talking about. So Citrix ADC.
Oh, that's ADM.
No, you got me. That's right, ADM. So ADCs as a service don't exist yet, but WAN Orchestrator and App ADM does.
So ADM in the cloud is just you deploy your agents within your network.
Yep.
And then those agents feed up to the cloud service,
right?
More or less. I mean, in a high level overview.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a large insurance firm in the Midwest U.S. that uses that.
So Blair, this has been great. I love getting on with the technical guys, and you're awesome, right? I ask you a question, you give me an answer, and you don't talk for 15 minutes about random stuff. I love that. I'm a technical guy at heart and a consultant at heart, and I love giving people answers and then letting them ask the next question. This has been great. Anything else you want to cover in this blog that either isn't written here or you want to add in addition to it?
I don't think I appreciate the time to talk about it. It's just the biggest thing about any kind of migration is have a plan before you proceed, and talk to the experts, get everybody's opinion, make sure licensing, port capacities, not only on the ADCs, but your whatever your network vendor is too. Make sure that you have enough 10 gig links and so on.
Yeah, that's great. You got a plan to succeed. No, you're going to have to change the plan, but at least you have a plan ahead of time going into it and as you do it. And then I'm sure you see it all the time where people just want to jump in and start turning the wrenches, and you know where that goes.
Yeah, I'm a planner though. I like to plan things out first.
Yeah. Well, good consultants do that. Good consultants not only plan, but they force people around them to plan. And a lot of engineers don't, right? A lot of engineers just want to jump in and start flipping switches, which, it typically ends up in a bad place. But, it's the difference between an engineer and a consultant.
It no difference in building a house. You got to start with your foundation and work your way up. You got to watch
that, right? You go to, if you ever build a house, either yourself or with a builder, you go to the planning center and you pick out stuff and you get all this on paper, like the house plan, what features you're going to add, what type of counters you're going to put in. And even then, if you've ever built a house, you probably change 5 times during that process, but you at least have to do your due diligence and do that effort first. But so many people don't want that. They want to rush through the project as fast as they can, and you end up getting what you get when you do that.
That's correct, and that's where applications get slow and so on. Do you go over your MPLS or do you go over the internet? I've had that question on almost any big project.
Yeah. Or worse yet, you get to a point where you've boxed yourself in the corner and there's a point of no return unless you spend a whole lot of money to get yourself out.
Yeah, that's usually government.
All right, Blair. Well, I appreciate you jumping on. I'm going to introduce you to, again, Chris Dorn on my team. You seem like an excellent resource for him to maybe chat with occasionally. But I really appreciate this. And, I'll keep an eye out. And if you have another blog that you post, anytime down the road, definitely let me know. I'd love to have you come on and walk through it. It just gives people there's 2 elements to what we're doing here with the podcast. One is it gives people a different way to consume the content. And 2, it forces me to stop once a week and learn with someone else. And that goes a long way from my personal evolution.
That's great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Blair.
Thank you for listening to the Citrix Session with your hosts, Andy Whiteside and Bill Sutton. A special thanks to our guest for attending today's podcast. Podcast produced by Pete Downing. For any input, or if you'd like to be a part of our podcast, please email us at info@XenTegra.com. Please head over to XenTegra.com/podcast to listen to all podcasts in this series. This podcast is copyrighted by XenTegra LLC.